Good evening. This is my first time using the nice new light. My flashy laptop's not in the way. Find me place. Wrong one. Okay. So the title I have given this talk is The Circle of Life. I hope at least a few of you imagined cartoon lions when I said that. So, as most of you know, we're having a baby. And that kind of thing makes you think a lot about, life, I suppose. We've got this app where every week it updates and it tells you how big the baby is and what kind of things they'll be developing during the week. So we've seen them go from like a bean to an olive to a strawberry to a lemon to an apple, and etc. So this week, week 28, our baby is apparently the size of a coconut. I'm sure Kat, much more than me, is dreading when they get to the likes of the watermelon. But as well, as I said, we've seen what kind of things they'll be growing and developing each week as well. So we've seen, for instance, when their heartbeat starts. We've seen when they've grown digits. We've seen when they've opened their eyes. This week, apparently, is when your baby can start crying in the womb, which I thought was a really weird and slightly sad one. But this kind of thing, it got me thinking a lot about predictable cycles, I suppose, because obviously each baby, each situation is slightly different. But it's amazing to think that with so much certainty, they can tell like exactly how a baby's going to grow and what kind of things it's going to develop in which order. Because it could have been just they start growing, you don't know how long they're going to take. But God's set this structure and this cycle. And when you look at so much of the world, so much of like science, there's this pattern of predictability. And even just like our own lives, like the more you look at how we live, how God set the things up, there's just these cycles, these patterns in our lives. I mean, even just down to the small things, the repetitions of days, day and night, sleep and wake. But even then within that, we've got times where we work, times where we rest. Like scientists would say that there's a certain amount of time you have to rest, like you work an hour, you have to rest 5 or 10 minutes. And then there's things like when we eat, we normally eat 3 meals a day. That's pretty standard. And then, days, weeks, God set up the 7 days, the Sabbath. So we've got, times of rest, which are, work rest. Then we've got wake sleep. Then we've got a whole week is almost work and sleep. And then months, you've got, the cycles of the moon. Years, the cycles of the sun going around, the earth going around the sun, and then you've got the seasons. You've got generations of time, animals, humans. It's sort of weird being in that place where now both my parents have retired, only just, and I'm now going to be a parent as well. So it feels like you've almost gone up a notch in like the cycle of humanity, as it were. And then obviously, the further you go, you've got all the celestial bodies, as it were. And you look up to the likes of the galaxy where things are moving around, and they say it'll take like millions of years to complete. But it's like, the finest, smallest details, even down to like the atoms, things spinning around the nucleus all the time, up to the biggest. It's always this structure and this cycle. And you can just tell how much God has set things up, both in nature and in us. That structure is so important. But I suppose the important thing is understanding when we can break structures and when we shouldn't. Similar, Jamie was saying the other week when he was talking about some fences you need to build and some fences you need to break down. Because there are cases, for instance, where, life can seem tedious because it's just repetition. And then psychologists and people will tell you, you need to break these cycles, you need to break these habits, you need to mix things up a bit, try new things. And then there's other things where maybe things are a bit more chaotic, and we need that structure in place in order to get back on track, really, I suppose. So breaking cycles can have good consequences, but breaking other cycles can have very bad consequences. Even just going back to the likes of the week, for instance, there was a time just after the French Revolution where the French were kind of getting obsessed into bringing in lots of atheism. And they decided, pretty much just as a move to get rid of the sort of religious structures of the nation, they decided to change it so it was a 10-day week instead of a 7, and that meant they had to put 1 day of rest at the end. And it became very unpopular because people realized that if they worked for 9 days and then rested for 1, it actually meant that people were a lot more overexerted, because the 7-day week is a lot more optimum, and God laid that out, thousands of years ago, and as soon as man tried to change it and control it, it doesn't work. And of course there's a big one, just going back in the Bible, right at the beginning of Genesis, God sets up Adam and Eve in the garden. And a big part of the reason why Adam and Eve attempted to sin is because it's like they believe that God's keeping them down, and they want to see, outside the garden. They want to be like God, and the serpent tempts them into like doing an act that will make them greater than what they are. So I suppose we'll just look into a couple of biblical examples of bad cycles. One example that really came to my mind was in the book of Judges, because when you read Judges, there's this constant cycle where the people they sin and do their own thing, and it talks about how they start worshipping idols. And God doesn't like them worshipping idols, of course, because He is the true God. And as soon as they start worshipping idols, they're worshipping something that man has created that's not the truth. So God sends people to lead them. These are the judges. And there's a few examples, like with Gideon, where the judge brings them back to the Lord. And then again, it talks about how when they weren't the judge anymore, the people went back and they started worshipping idols again. And you've got this cycle of sin and then bringing out of sin and then people just sliding back. And in many ways, it reminds me of cycles of addiction, really, because it's this cycle of you feel like you need something, so you take it, and then maybe you're in a place where you regret, and then you can be pulled out of it. But as soon as that time is sort of cleared, you kind of slide back into the addiction, and you want it all over again. Just the last verse of Judges, 21 verse 25, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." And the interesting thing here is that this was God's initial prescription for how they should live, in a sense. So they are actually freer before they have a king. But then as you look into Samuel, it talks about how the people demanded of Samuel that they would get a king. And it feels like this is people trying to trade one bad cycle that they're going through for another. Because if you look at history, at this point, kings was something that was happening in the world around them. It'd been going on for hundreds of years, and in every other country, when a king came in, they basically took control. They were an autocrat. So the people should have known that they would lose their freedom. And in 1 Samuel 8, there's a few verses here where the people have demanded this of Samuel, and he basically tells them, why would you want a king in the first place? So 1 Samuel 8 verse 11, for instance, it says, "And he said, This will be the manner of a king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, and his chariots to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots." And you go down a bit. For instance, verse 14, "He will take your fields, your vineyards, your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and your vineyards, and give to his officers and his servants." And verse 18, it says, "And you shall cry out in that day because of your king, which he shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." It definitely feels like an example of be careful what you wish for, I suppose. The people got themselves in this bad cycle, and they wanted to swap it for something else. But of course, what they wanted to swap it for really wasn't a good thing either. Again, it goes to show man generally are the problem and have a bad vision of what is right for us. But what is interesting, of course, is that the Lord brings good out of that, because he starts off by giving them an example of a bad king in Saul, but then David, which is anointed by Samuel later on, is an example of a good king and a man after God's own heart. So even though the people wanted something which was not good for them in a sense, God made the best of that for them. I'll just turn over to Romans chapter 7. This is a chapter I often come back to, actually. It feels almost uncharacteristic of Paul when you look at a lot of his other letters, because he comes across as, obviously a very wise leader, someone who generally, is very pure of heart, very upstanding. But Romans 7 really seems like he's opening up and very vulnerable about what he's going through and about his weaknesses and his own sin. And again, this comes across to me as someone who's almost in some kind of cycle of addiction. So from Romans 7 verse 13, for instance, was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment may become exceeding sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. It's quite an awkward passage to read from the front. It sounds very different in your head, but then as soon as you speak it out, it's like, woo. But just when you read that, it's real and down to earth, sort of opening up about how difficult sin can be. Because Paul himself, he talks a lot about how, he himself, he doesn't want to do things, but he does them anyway. And there are things that he wants to do, but he doesn't. And again, it all comes back to, I suppose, the power of sin over us in a way. And then when you go to the end of the chapter, verse 24, he says, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death?" Which is, again, a very sort of sobering verse, I suppose, that someone as upstanding as Paul would say something like that. But even if you just go to the beginning of the chapter, starting from verse 1, it says, "Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman which has an husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he lives. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if, while her husband lives, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. It's easy to sort of think that the law is restrictive, as we've often said. Like when you look at the Old Testament, there's a lot of rituals. Again, it's like the cycles, the priesthood, the rituals of the sacrifice and things like that. And a lot of people now, they wonder why the Old Testament were under such a strict law, but then why do we not hold on to that now? but again, I suppose it feels like it comes down to this idea that God has actually given us a better freedom. Because at the end of the day, the law is a structure that was given for a nation. And if you sin under the law, you would be into the hands of man, and you would be instantly given the consequences of that sin, whether that was punishment of death or whatever. But now we almost have a freedom. God's given us that freedom to sin, but to live in a sense like with Judges. We trying to think how to phrase this now. I suppose we're given the freedom to live, to sin or to not sin, and we are reprieved from the immediate punishment. But then God has delayed that, so when He returns and the judgment takes place, that's when that's when people would see the result of their sin. But God has given us that freedom now, which is good, because even when we do sin, as Paul did, God's got us, and He's got that solution for us to be pulled out of it, by being freed by the Holy Spirit, by following Jesus. I don't feel like that was explained the best, but sometimes the word of the Lord does the explaining itself. But I suppose what I'm getting at is the Old Testament is an example of what we deserve, but the New Testament is God's redemption, and He's bringing us out of that cycle of sin and grief. So if we move on to good cycles to aim for, because again there's a lot of examples there. So a couple that I thought was interesting. So for instance, with it talks about Naaman when he was going to be healed from leprosy, and Elisha told him to wash 7 times. And similar with the Battle of Jericho, where the Jews marched 7 times around the city and blew the trumpets. These are both examples where God has prescribed an action to be repeated 7 times. And particularly with Naaman, the sort of the human understanding of this would be that you wash, say, once, and you clean 1/7 of the illness, as it were, and then when you've completed the 7, then you're fully clean. But the interesting thing about it is he has to clean exactly 7 times, and then as soon as he has finished the 7th, he goes from almost not clean to fully clean. So it's God prescribing a particular action that is the solution itself. And a big action that I suppose God has prescribed us to carry on over and over is just the simple things like coming to meetings, praying in the Holy Spirit, as is set out in the Old Testament sort of priesthood. There's a big sort of undertone in this, I suppose, about being all in as well. God prescribed in these particular cases 7 days, and 7 is a specific number. The people had to go all in. They had to complete all the cycles of it for it to work. One, I suppose, sort of cycle in nature as well, is the water cycle. Because this is a big one that a lot of scientists didn't understand, and it was in the Bible. But then it wasn't until scientists discovered it in like the 1700s or something. But there are many places where it actually appears in the Bible. So there's one in Isaiah 55. Verse 9, for instance, it says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain comes down, and the snow from heaven, and returns not thither, but watereth the earth, and make it to bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower, and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it." And I suppose the water cycle in itself feels like nature is teaching us the right sort of cycle to have in our own lives. Like going over biblical prophecy, you see how the sea is the people, and the nations come out of it as beasts. But then in the water cycle, you see you see the vapors are ascended out from the sea, and they rise up to the heavens, become clouds, and then the clouds rain on the world, and the rivers bring life to the earth, and then that returns into the sea. So there's this constant cycle and this constant flow of life and goodness. And for instance, you go back to like the ancient world, and a big part of the reason why Egypt was such a prospering nation was because the River Nile was so abundant, and it was so predictable exactly what time the banks of the river would flood. So they knew exactly when to harvest, exactly when everything would be very plentiful. So again, it's that structure and that cycle that God has given us. Similar with sort of fasting, in Isaiah 58. There's a big section there where it talks about how to fast. In verse 6 it says, "Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke?" So in some senses, fasting in itself is sort of to bring you out of the monotony of normal life, to refocus yourself on the Lord. But in another sense, it is, I suppose, reinforcing the godly cycle that he wants us to have, because in some senses, when we are born again, we fast from a lot of life permanently. That's what we're called to do. So when we set ourselves focusing towards God in that special time of fasting, and obviously traditionally we might fast from food, but there are many other things we can fast from as well, even just day to day. I'm sure many of us can empathise how good it can be to take a fast from our phones, for instance, because that seems to be a massive problem in this day and age. So yeah, I'll just finish off with a couple of scriptures. If we turn over to Psalms chapter 30. In verse 4 and 5, it says, "Sing unto the Lord, O ye saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. For his anger endures but a moment, in his favour is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." it's just one of those where I just had to slip that in because it's such a nice verse, I suppose, and it gives such a good impression of the goodness of God. And in itself, it's sort of a reminder of the sort of the ebbs and flows of life. But the fact that it says joy comes in the morning, God is always willing to give us that extra chance of forgiveness, of I suppose being better the next time. Yeah, it's just nice. I'll finish up in Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is actually one of my personal favourite scriptures as well. So in the last two verses, chapter 19 and 20, it says, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your seed may live, that you may love the Lord your God, and you may obey his voice, and you may cleave unto him, for he is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. So I suppose this is just a reminder that at all points in our lives we have choices to make. Many will take us down a bad path, many will take us down the right path towards God, and God always gives us that choice to choose what is right and what points us towards life. So we shouldn't be stuck in cycles of traditions. As Tom talked about how we've brought up in the Catholic Church, there's a lot of doing things which people have just done for centuries, just because that's the way things are done, not because that's what's right. We should be vigilant in where we stand with the Lord, to always be looking at what's right and wrong by the word of the Lord. He's given us such a gift with the word of the Lord to always be able to see what's right and wrong where we are in life. And God doesn't restrict us and hold us down like Adam and Eve in the Bible. They wanted something better. God doesn't hold us down like that. And the proof of that is that he has given us a way to break the ultimate cycle of life and death by bringing us to a place where we can walk with him in eternity. And all the people said? We'll have a prayer line now.